Hi, my name's Matthew Barge.
I'm Darren McCall.
Hello, my name is Mika.
Hi, I'm Betty. Today we will be presenting on Housing New Zealand Corporation. First, Matthew will be looking at Maori land issue and how disproportionately represented in state housing. Next, I will be discussing Housing New Zealand's governing structure in relation to accountability to public and the Parliament. Mika will present about current and future development, and Darren will be wrapping up by presenting the financial and operational performance.
A bit of background on issues surrounding Maori land. The Department of Housing and Building has identified that there's a significant undersupply of affordable housing across New Zealand. And it's also the case that Maori average incomes are quite a bit lower than nationwide average incomes, which means it's proving difficult for Maori to build and buy homes. One possible solution to this problem is better utilisation of Maori-owned land and helping Maori to achieve this. The other stumbling block is that Maori land developers come against is the fact that banks are often unwilling to accept Maori land as security for financing the development of the land. The reason being that it proves difficult to sell due to some categories of land facing provisions around the ownership of it. So as you can see below, are 4 categories of land that the Auditor General's report listed. 3 of these are subject to provisions regarding who can own these and if they can even be sold. So this would substantiate the idea that it does prove difficult for Maori to build and develop land. And so this has led the government to look for viable ways of making it possible. So the accountability aspect of Housing New Zealand's approach to Maori land issues is to do with the schemes which they have administered with the aim of improving the housing situation for Maori. The first of those schemes is the Kiwibank loan scheme, aimed at individual households and of which they are the underwriters. However, while this scheme demonstrates a degree of accountability, the fact that only one loan has been made since 2010 would suggest that the scheme could be classed as a failure. The Auditor General's report on this issue found that the main reasons that these loans were not being made was because applicants couldn't feasibly service the loans, and ironically those that could often service loans didn't meet the criteria and were just outside of it. The report also found that there was a lack of information available to those inquiring about finance through the loan scheme, and I'll touch on this area on the next slide. And there's also issues which are more outside of Housing New Zealand's control, such as cooperation amongst landowners, where it can prove difficult to develop land and get cooperation amongst numerous parties and interest in that one piece of land. So as you can see, there are a few issues over how accountable they are holding themselves when it should be pretty clear of the shortcomings of the selection criteria for actually awarding loans. With regards to the Maori Demonstration Partnership, this is aimed at organisations and groups, and the scheme has actually had some success due to the cooperation it leads to, and is probably the main reason that organisations and groups, group-based schemes, have now been advocated. The information on the slide will also indicate that the requirements of the scheme shouldn't be particularly onerous to land developers. So I think it's fair to say that accountability and transparency are fairly intertwined, and that with regards to the lack of information and advice, this can be seen as a transparency issue. The Auditor General found that when Maori land developers were seeking advice and information, they hit an immediate stumbling block, which was that they had to go through at least 3 different agencies to get the information they needed. However, HNZ is the main source of information on obtaining finance, so we would assume that in this case, transparency would be represented by easily accessible information and appropriate advice, but this didn't seem to be the case. It was noted how staff on the front line, such as those at Kiwibank, often didn't have the necessary knowledge to assist inquirers, and HNZ said that they experienced funding constraints and weren't able to train them. They then, however, said that even with funds, they probably wouldn't do so. So there does seem to be a lack of accountability here as well. The same goes for lack of information at branches. For MDP, one issue those interviewed raised was that they often didn't know whether it was worth contesting for an allocation from the fund, as the criteria about who would qualify wasn't really available. On a positive note, though, people who had progressed past the first stage did note that HNZ's project managers did have a good knowledge of how finance worked and provided effective support as and when they needed it.
Housing New Zealand is a statutory corporation set up under the Housing Corporation Act 1974. It is a Crown agency under the Crown Entity Act 2004. Their mission is to provide high-quality, subsidized rental homes to people in the greatest need for the duration of their needs. Within this corporation, there are three responsible ministers. Bill English, Minister responsible for Housing New Zealand. He has direct responsibility for the operational oversight of the corporation. Paula Bennett, Minister for Social Housing. She has responsibility for the government's social housing functions and maintains a relationship with the social housing sector. Dr. Nick Smith, Minister for Building and Housing. He is responsible on making housing affordable and construction issues. Bill English and Paula Bennett will monitor organizations' performance, as well as stating government's expectations. On behalf of government, Bill gives out two documents, Statements of Intent and Statements of Performance Expectation. These two documents were given to Housing New Zealand and Parliament yearly. Statements of Intent sets out Housing New Zealand's strategic direction for the next 3 years. It shows how the activity of the organization will achieve their goals. Statements of Performance Expectations set out Housing New Zealand's annual operational performance measure and forecast financial statements for the next financial year. Bill and Paula will also receive performance monitoring reports every quarter from Housing New Zealand. In addition to this, the organization will submit their annual reports to Parliament to show performance. The expectation from the minister will directly have an impact on the decision undertaken by the Board of Housing New Zealand. The board comprises of 8 non-executive members. They are responsible and accountable for the management and strategic direction of Housing New Zealand. Furthermore, the board selects, appoints, and monitors the performance of the chief executive, whom is responsible to the board for efficient and effective running of Housing New Zealand.
There are 4 things affect Housing New Zealand's operating environment. The first one, social housing reform. The social housing reform program will increase the supply of social housing in New Zealand. It's built on measures taken over recent years to provide more New Zealanders in need with quality housing. It will help more New Zealanders into housing independence when they can making that transaction. Second, changing population. New Zealand's population is expected to grow by between 400,000 and 650,000 by 2025, and increase to around 5.9 million by 2041. Auckland is expected to have the largest population growth and to make up 2 million of the total population by 2033, an increase of more than 500,000 over the period. At the same time, the population is getting older, with the percentage of people aged over 65 years expected to make up between 21 and 22% of population in 2032, up from 14% in 2014. This population changes will impact on the demand of social housing. The current stock will not meet the demand of the future, so they are focusing on asset management activities, on making sure their houses are in the right place and of the right type to meet both current and future demand. Third, house quality. The government is looking closely at the issue of housing quality and in particularly how social housing can be improved and how to deliver good health and social outcomes. As a result, the government has decided to introduce regulate minimum standards for smoking alarm. They are now in the final stages of rebuilding and repairing our earthquake-damaged house in Canterbury, as well as repairing structural damage caused by the Canterbury earthquake. Housing New Zealand has used opportunity to make other improvements to this house. This massive level of activity will be completed in coming 2 financial years and will restore Christchurch state housing number back to pre-earthquake levels. It will also result in some of the most modern and restored social housing in the country.
Now, let me ask you a question. What is performance? Well, a common interpretation is it's an indicator used to assess how well an organization or business is achieving its desired objectives. So when we measure Housing New Zealand's performance, we really need to be thoughtful and take all the factors into account, such as its nature, accountabilities, and operational environment. First, let's analyze its performance through financial perspective. As Patty mentioned in the accountability slides, under Section 40 of the Housing Corporation Act 1974, as amended, the HNZC Group is required to pay annual surplus to the Crown, unless the responsible minister authorizes Housing New Zealand to keep all or any part of it. Housing New Zealand also returns a social dividend to the Crown as a result of the service it provides to its customers. The table on the slide set out the annual distribution that Housing New Zealand has paid to the Crown since 2006 and 2007. The annual distribution is paid after year-end once Housing New Zealand's accounts have been finalized. Housing New Zealand manages a portfolio of more than 68,000 houses. The value of owned proportion of the portfolio is $18.4 billion. The 2014-15 operation surplus before tax is $118 million, with dividend to distribution to the Crown being $107 million, as set out in the Housing New Zealand's 2014 and 15 annual report. In addition to the annual distribution, Housing New Zealand also pays taxes and properties and water rates. Indeed, Housing New Zealand has achieved some strong financial performance results in recent years, but as a core entity, Housing New Zealand's role is to provide warm and dry home to those New Zealanders who are most in need. It's aimed to be the social housing provider of choice as other providers start to play a great part within the sector. So we cannot only measure its performance from financial perspective, but also from operational perspective. Over the last 4 years, Housing New Zealand has undergone a transformational change as a result of government's decision that it should focus on its core business of tenancy and asset management. In 2012, Housing New Zealand implemented a new and more responsive service delivery model, updated its core system to provide high tools for frontline staff, and found a streamlined process of increased operating efficiency. Since then, Housing New Zealand has been focused on keeping the needs of customers at the center of its thinking and lifting performance in a number of key business areas. For example, nearly 20% of more customers and their families were housed during 2013 and 14 than previous year. And the average turnaround time between the tenancies reduced from 72 days at the start of the year to just 50 days by the end of the year. Turnaround time has since reduced even further to 32 days at the end of September 2014. Now, Housing New Zealand is committed to finalizing the development of this new social housing market and is in a great position to take the leadership role to support the sector, so it's a significant period of change.
So, in conclusion, the low home ownership amongst Maori is a symptom of other issues. However, Housing New Zealand no longer oversees housing issues in relation to Maryland. The Department of Building and Housing now has this responsibility. In the 2014 and 2015 financial period, Housing New Zealand achieved strong operational performance due to significant changes within the organization. This resulted in reduction of turnaround time between tenancies to 34 days. Overall, Housing New Zealand has a good structure in place, which enables the governments to monitor the organization. This is in the best interest of the public. Housing New Zealand provides effective and efficient service to its 200,000 existing tenants, which are some of the most vulnerable individuals in society.
So one of the questions we received was, does the support offered by Housing New Zealand compensate for the lack of transparency in terms of the information available to inquirers? Now, I believe that the information for inquirers needs to be easily accessible and readily available in order to get inquirers started on the process of getting the finance, developing the land, and getting the houses built. As noted, this wasn't the case with the Housing New Zealand overseeing schemes, though. So for the Maori demonstration project, there wasn't that much clarity over the criteria that applicants might need to meet in order to get an allocation from the fund. With Kiwibank, they found that the staff on the front line dealing with people's initial inquiries didn't have the relevant or the necessary knowledge to help the inquirers sufficiently. And there was also the case that local branches weren't well enough stocked with information on getting finance and the rest of the processes as well. Also, project managers seem to come into the process further down the line, so obviously they're not on the front line at Kiwibank giving out advice. So while they do have the necessary depth of knowledge, they're not able to provide that knowledge until those inquirers have already started on the path to getting the finance and so on. So I don't think this makes up for the lack of transparency or the lack of information available at the first stage. And also, well, in conclusion, I would say that the project manager's efforts and knowledge does not compensate for the lack of transparency at the first stage, because it's so important that that information is available at the first stage, so that inquirers get started down the path to getting finance and hopefully getting properties developed.
For the question, do you think Housing New Zealand is performing well? I think yes. As a social housing agency, they work with Ministry of Social Department to deliver better public service, understanding of who their customers are and the level of service they required, and also provide high quality houses, and also meet housing and safety requirements.
The question was, in statistics, you showed on the housing targets, the actual result exceeds the target. So are the Housing New Zealand targets are too low to begin with? The answer is, first of all, a company's target setting needs to follow 5 criteria, which are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. Secondly, Housing New Zealand as a crown entity is has a key role to play in helping government to achieve government's better service public service target and its priorities, such as driving a better result and a better value for money from the public service, and supporting the rebuild of Christchurch within tight financial constraints. So I think the answer is no. Housing New Zealand's targets shouldn't be too low to begin with, just the opposite. It's required to set a number of specific and challenging direction and targets which are agreed to the government. Thank you.